Shalom and welcome to the TLV Podcast. It's called TLV Talk. And we're the ones who came up with the Messianic Jewish Family Bible, and the Tree of Life translation is the translation inside it. So if you'd like to know more about how you even come up with translations, where did they come from, and how did we come up with this one? Well, that's an interesting question. So I have a special guest for you to meet today. His name is Dr. Jeffery Seif. And Dr. Jeffery Seif is the chief theologian of the Tree of Life Bible Society. So he's going to show you how the biblical texts have been collected and grown into the translations that we enjoy today. So join us. We're about to study the Bible together.
Your name is above all powers, above all kings. Your name.
Welcome. This is TLV Talk, and I'm Daniah Greenberg with the Tree of Life Bible Society, and this is my buddy,
Jeffery Seif.
Dr. Jeffery Seif. And Dr. Seif, we have been friends for many, many years now. We've been working on the Tree of Life Bible Society project, right?
Yes, we have.
And so the Tree of Life Bible was published in 2014. The whole thing was done, which means we had the New Testament done before we finished the full Bible. And I got to know you when we were doing the Old Testament portion. Now, we think of the TLV as one book. We don't really separate it into old and new. We think of the fullness of God's covenant through Yeshua. We love Jesus, in case anybody wants to know, and we love the Word of God. So together, we've been working on bringing forth the translation of the Tree of Life Bible, and I wanted to talk to you about the questions that I get asked by people that you know the answers to, where I can't answer them as directly. Sound good?
Let's do it.
Okay. Where did the Bible come from, and what was the first Bible that was available to human beings?
Well, when you say the Bible, what do we want to talk about? Because I could probably find a better word, but it's something of an evolutionary process.
Okay.
That is to say, if you look at the Older Testament.
Right. We'll call it old or newer.
It's played out over a 1,000-year period of time.
Okay.
And so different materials percolated and developed, and then it's put together where there's some semblance of a canon, a collection. But even that's not really solidified. There's some books that are just kind of at the outskirts of it, that there's questions about it, and there's books that were included that were removed.
Okay.
So, I mean, it happens over a period of time. Same thing with the Newer Testament, by the way.
Absolutely.
You're not working with 1,000-year. I mean, the Older Testament's played out on 3 continents, a 1,000-year span. The Newer Testament, we're just really going through to the end of the 1st century. But even then, there's different movement in different locations.
Okay, let me see if I can feedback what you said, because you just said a lot. And so I think of things where they fit in time and space. So because my personal relationship with God is always growing and expanding like a megaphone, just like time goes forward or a sound wave goes forward, and I think of God's voice as, I think of the Bible as God speaking to us over time. So He, in my opinion, just my opinion, He spoke to us in a garden, right? Individually and between couples, right? And then He spoke to us as a family through Noah. And then He spoke to us through generations with Abraham. Then He spoke to us through a nation with Moses. And then when Yeshua comes, He speaks to us both individually and to the whole world at the same time. So I think when you talk about the creation of the Bible, I want to try to understand what you're saying. If I heard you correctly, you said that the Older Testament was created over 3 continents over 1,000 years.
Yeah, there's 1,000 years history in that. And even when you talk about Gan Eden,
Gan Eden is Garden of Eden.
And Abraham, and we talk about that voice, that story. By the time Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses speaks,
right,
it's hundreds of years later.
Exactly, and people don't know that.
And you know that by the time you get out of the book Bereshit or Genesis,
right,
by the time you get to Shemot or Exodus, hundreds of years have passed.
Yeah,
and even the what's called the Law of Moses, it kind of takes place over a period of time.
Right. So in other words, it's not just the 10 Commandments given there's the growth of from the 10 commandments, the 10 words, right, to the whole of the Torah.
Yeah, it's a developing story.
Right.
Let's talk about story.
Exactly.
Even the term the law of Moses, I don't prefer it. But of course, the world doesn't revolve around my preferences. The reason why I don't prefer the language, especially because of what people are fed to understand, legalistic, anal retentive, the rules, and there's a perspective as, there's the New Testament, the new book.
Yeah,
and there's
all's glorious. Jesus has come, so everything's forgiven, and
Right,
whatever you want to do works as long as you keep repenting.
You're interrupting me. I
Sorry.
had a little thing there. There's the Newer Testament, the new book, and then there's the Older Testament, which is the Jew book. And the Jew book, it's just anal retentive, a God of rules, etc. That's overly simplistic. If you look at the core of the Hebrew Bible, the law of Moses, so-called, the 5 books.
Right.
Genesis, it's all narrative, it's storytelling. Exodus, it's narrative, it's storytelling until we get to the 10 Commandment story. And then there's some, standards of living, and then there's some amplification, but then it's the story of the manufacture of the accoutrements for the tabernacle. Leviticus is principally, though not exclusively, it's stuff pertaining to the Levites who were officiating in the tabernacles. Numbers is the story of how they schlepped around the wilderness.
Right.
And Deuteronomy is just a recap of everything that took place to that point in time. So the point is, even the law is a whole lot of storytelling going on in there. It's not just rules and standards.
I agree. I spend a significant amount of time in the Proverbs every day with the same narrative. The Torah, the 5 books, I think of them as round. And when I think of them as round, what I mean by that is you've got Genesis, which happens before Moses is talked to by God. And Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh shows up and talks to Moses, right? And then there's the Deuteronomy, which is the retelling, sometimes called the second Torah. I heard, is that true?
Yeah, Deuteronomy comes from the Greek deuteronomos, which means second law.
Oh my gosh, that's so good.
It's not that there's a second law, it's a recap. There's a second generation.
Right.
The older crowd has died off, and now we're kind of reiterating for the new crew that's going to go in and take the promised land.
I think one of the things that I really understand about the Bible, and once you see it, you can't unsee it, is that the Lord tells stories. The Bible seems to me like it's circular, because he'll tell the story like the first 7 days of creation, and then he starts over again and tells it again, only adds more. And then you get to chapter 5 and he tells it again, the genealogies of Adam, and goes forward. It seems to me as if, as the story unfolds, because the scrolls the funny part about reading on a scroll as opposed to reading in a book is when you read in a book, you can look anywhere you want in it. But when you read in a scroll, you have to read it sequentially. And that idea of reading it sequentially year after year is so helpful, because it's practicing the word as opposed to just learning it or just studying some portion that you want to make fit into what's applicable in your life and what you're going through. The consistency of the revolving of the Torah in my life, when read with the Gospels and Acts also, to me, it gives me a trajectory so I know where I am with God in my relationship with Him. So you've got the Deuteronomy, which is the second telling, or this, right? The second Torah is how some people say it. I want to be so careful with language, not confuse people. But then Genesis happens before.
Let me confuse people with language.
Yeah, why don't you confuse them?
That's what I do for a living.
You confuse them. I'm the artist. Okay, so, but when you say roughly 1,000, it develops over a 1,000-year period. The period between the end of Joseph's story, right, and the beginning of Moses' story is how many years?
What is it?
It's about 400, right?
Yeah.
Right, which that works for me and what you're saying, because that means that from when Moses hears God's voice to the end of what we consider, people call the Older Testament, all of the prophets and the writings, that's over a 1,000-year period. So that 1,400 makes sense to me. I just want you to know that I appreciate you clarifying that. So tell me how it grows from the time of Moses receiving the Torah and writing down these words for us.
Well, if you look in the literature, if you just look at it as history, now it's not just history. I mean, it is history if it tells his story.
Right,
that is
right,
the Lord's.
right. Yeah.
But if you look at it as literature and you just want to know what books came when, if you look at Mosaic literature, it's in effect a foundational constitution for a community.
Right. 100%.
And then the community makes its way through time and circumstance. We get far away from Moses. Hundreds of years pass, and we're in Eretz Canaan, the land of Canaan, to be Israel.
Eretz Israel, the land of Israel.
Yeah,
Eretz, land.
So we're there, and eventually we'll have the first, monarch who's appointed, Saul, and then he doesn't fare well, and then David and
He
Solomon.
tries to talk to the dead and witches. You don't do that.
Once you have a monarchy, then you have a court, then you assemble scholars, and you have the history written. If you look at the books of Samuel and Kings, it'll tell us about Saul and David and subsequent generation of kings. Once you have kings, then there's literature associated with them. You have sapiental or wisdom literature, the Proverbs of Solomon. David uses his influence with Psalms to collect those. There's 75 of those that bear his inscription. Not all of them, but the literature is associated with him. Mm-hmm. You start to have the collection of literature. Then you have the kingdoms. You have Saul, you have David, Solomon. Solomon's son comes to power. There's a civil war, and then prophets are emerging to try and get people to
turn back to God. Right.
Amos and Hosea with the northern kingdom. You have 6 prophets in the southern kingdom. We're making our way through time and circumstance. There's disobedience, there's destruction, there's exile. There's prophets during the exile. They come back after exile. And there's more prophets that speak them, and there's more books that speak about the narrative then. So it progresses over time in the Older Testament. Arguably, the literature is we're collecting it.
Right.
When we're in the Babylonian captivity.
Babylonian exile, yeah.
Yes, and so we're really at the end of the Older Testament.
Right.
In the days of Ezra, Nehemiah,
Mm-hmm.
you have the prophetic administrations of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi.
Hold on a second. What is a prophetic administration?
Well,
Because that's wild sounding.
Is they come back from exile from Babylonia, those that return.
Right.
And there's prophets who minister to this crop of people, this group of returnees in Judea who are going to be known as Jews. The common language to refer to these people, they weren't called Jews. And the religion wasn't called Judaism.
Right.
When they come back from exile, during exile, they developed the synagogue, and it hadn't existed beforehand. And once you have a meeting place where they're displaced from their ancestral homeland, but they want to keep the religious ideas alive. Mm-hmm. We're gathering the principal literature and teaching it. You have the beginning of a caste called scribes who are writing the literature. You have the rabbi who's offering a telling of it. And the institutions that we're used to seeing in the synagogue today, and the developing of a literature and someone competent to give a telling of the literature happens during the Babylonian captivity, and they bring it back. And you see it emergent at the end of the Older Testament era in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra is referred to as a scribe. We don't hear about scribes in Moses. And Ezra the scribe and Nehemiah, individuals, they get up and they're teachers. They give a telling of the literature. They explain the sense. And this is the rabbinate that we're familiar with. So all this stuff develops into the New Testament era. But there's still questions, residual questions, about what's going to constitute the sacred literature of Israel. You have the Torah, the law of Moses, the principal historical literature, but there's questions about what do we want to include and exclude in the sacred collection. That's going to be firmed up and ratified later on.
Firmed up and ratified.
Yes.
Okay, so when people ask me, what's the Septuagint? What's that?
Well, again, as we make our way through time and circumstance, Hebrews return from Babylonia to Judea. In Babylonia, they had Aramaic texts called Targums, Jonathan and Ankelos. Targums, Aramaic
Good.
paraphrase texts.
Never heard of those two other things you just
so,
said.
So the literature is translated in the lingua franca, in the language of the day. They're in Babylonia. We're looking at Aramaic.
Okay.
So they come back to Judea. They have the Aramaic translations. What happens through time and circumstance, Babylonia is overrun by Persia, of course. Persia is overrun by the Greeks. And the Greeks don't just conquer militarily and socially. They inculcate their values and vision and language.
And myths. And faith and those kinds of things.
Once the world becomes Greek,
right,
you have Greek language. And the Septuagint is a translation that was penned by 72 Hebrew scholars in Egypt around 250 BC. You have a Greek version, not of the Old Testament complete initially, but of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses.
So the Septuagint's only the Torah?
No, it starts with that
the
translation,
Torah.
And then we're developing, before you know it, everything's going to be translated into Greek, because that's the lingua franca, that's the language of the day.
Lingua franca means language of the day.
Yes.
That's what that means.
What they spoke.
Okay.
Yes. The idea is if you're going to have speech, it needs to be intelligible, and so.
No, it also morphs. I don't think people realize that. I don't think people realize how much language changes, and how language is based on the other person understanding it. That's why language is an art, not just a science.
True.
Science you can drill down to like a microscope. Mm-hmm. Language is more like a telescope, where there has to be space for a relationship to form, for you to communicate properly. And if there was one thing I think I understand as being a woman in the way that we process the Bible, and it's funny because I think it helps me to give more grace to my male counterparts, to the men of this world that I love, that love the Bible like I do, that women, sometimes we have to, what we think something says or what someone means is based on the relationship we have with them. And so tone matters, and there's so much to communication that goes beyond just the binary black ink on a white page, that space and filling that space with relationship is part of communicating. So how you relate to your environment and how you relate to language is what you develop your belief system around. So I appreciate your willingness to talk to me about these things, because it's not that I want to be able to spit out all the knowledge that you've learned. I want to help people understand that the written words on the page that are translated, that they're sealed by your relationship with God, because language has changed. But relating to the God of the universe is just as alive and real today if we'll engage in the study of studying biblical literature. So I appreciate your willingness to talk to me about these things, even though they make me feel really stupid, because there's so much I don't know. What I do know is that the Bible is true. And the reason it's true is because of my relationship with God that has developed because of reading it. So in developing the language of the Bible, we're going from the Septuagint, which people talk about, like, that's the first thing people bring up with me. Well, what is, they want to understand the Septuagint. So can we just recap that one more time for me so I understand it?
The world changes, and
language changes.
We're speaking Greek principally.
Right.
And so we want a Greek translation. Jewish scholars wanted a Greek translation. If you look at funerary inscriptions.
What is funerary?
If you look at people that die and they write on their tombstones.
Can you just okay? So I'm the lady who says
Okay,
people who
here.
die and write on their tombstones because I really don't get the larger language sometimes.
Funeral inscriptions. If you
Okay.
look, when someone's making some statement, they're being commended to the afterworld. If you look at funerary inscriptions in first century Judea, only 4% of them are in Hebrew. The lion's share are in Greek and then in Latin as well. And it's interesting. It's a religious moment when you commend yourself to the divine, but it attests to the fact that Greek culture and language really has penetrated into the first century world. Another illustration that people may be familiar with, even when Jesus is on the cross and we want to put the sign King of the Jews on it, we got to do it in 3 languages just to make sure everybody gets it.
Right.
Now, why is that? Greek had penetrated even in the Talmud, and I'll explain, which is a collection of Pharisaic Jewish thought. There's 6,000 Greek loanwords in the Talmud, and it reflects the way the language had penetrated. Now, the Septuagint is a Greek translation. Interestingly, however, it was in no uncertain terms condemned by Jewish religious authorities. From 70 to 90 AD, Jewish religious authorities convened in a town called Yavne. And Judaism is a religion as we know it now.
Okay, so wait, we have to stop for 1 second. So you're talking about between 70 and 90. So when was temple worship in Jerusalem? Where was temple worship ended? When did the destruction of the temple happen? Because that's what I think people need to understand.
The temple was destroyed in 70 AD.
Right.
And that was, religious shrine sacred to the Hebrew people. A rabbi, Yochanan ben Zakkai, was smuggled out of the temple, smuggled out of the city.
Right.
Anybody so Jerusalem is under siege.
How was he smuggled?
He was smuggled out in a coffin, interestingly. And let me just say, the Romans were keen on accepting anyone who surrendered to them. If they vacated the city, they were given quarter. And so
they were given quarter, meaning they were allowed to.
They were allowed to live and breathe and move. In fact, there were many that surrendered, and the Romans transported them to other places under Roman guard.
Are you kidding?
No.
Wow.
There's a fascinating story.
I didn't know anything about that.
Yeah, even the story of the siege of Jerusalem, Jews that surrendered to the Romans were given passage and guided to Petra, where they set up headquarters again.
Oh my
The Romans were happier to transport people than they were to fight them and kill them and risk getting killed by them.
Well, it's also because you can't change the culture that people are born with. And so if you want to change the culture, you change their location, you change their language,
Yes.
and you take their children and start teaching their children.
Right.
Which, for the record, is why we're in the state we're in today, because I really feel like we need to get back to teaching children the Bible.
Let me get back to Yochanan ben
Of course.
Zakkai with that
Very
point.
interesting.
Not that you're tangential. So Yochanan ben Zakkai, a leading sage, is smuggled out. And he petitions the authorities, look, we know you're going to win. And what we want to do is kind of reconstitute, And so Yochanan ben Zakkai was given permission to go to Yavne in northern Israel.
Oh my gosh.
And he convened the Council of Yavne, where all the Jewish scribes, scholars met. And okay, the temple's destroyed in 70 AD. What next? What now? And Judaism was fabricated as a religion without a temple, without a sacrifice.
Right.
The way we know it today.
Right.
But along with that, at Yavne, they condemned the Septuagint as a text.
I just have to tell you that I don't think I know 5 people who know that to be true. That's wildly important.
Well, that's one of the benefits of being a doctor. You learn things that nobody cares about. But what happened is that the Septuagint was condemned, arguably in part because the Septuagint was the popular version that was being used by the Jewish believers in Yeshua. There's a bit of a family feud here.
Yeah.
For example, if you go to the New Testament...
That helps so much, Dr. Seif.
If you go to the New Testament and you're looking, here's a Newer Testament text where the author is citing the Older Testament. If you go back to the Older Testament, you'll see it reads a little differently in the Old Testament text than it does in the New Testament citation of it. Well, you can go, well, who got it right? What's going on here? The Newer Testament is using the Septuagint, the Greek text.
Wow.
Whereas the translations of the Bible use the Hebrew text,
That's right.
the Masoretic.
That's right.
And the LXX or the Septuagint may be consulted, but you're working from different texts. So it's interesting, even in the Bible, as we know it today, the Old and the New Testament, we're working with variant translations.
That's right. So when we did the Tree of Life Bible, we went to the Masoretic text and to the 27th Nestle Aland. Is that the right way to say that?
Yes.
Because I used to say it all the time years ago, but it's not something people ask me today. Tell me about keeping that in mind, the 27th Nestle Aland Testamente Grece, right? Greek text. Is that what that means?
Okay, let's go to the Greek text now. We talked in this program, introductory program, we talked about the Older Testament.
Right.
And now the Newer Testament.
Okay.
How did we come by it, and how did we get to this?
Right, from Septuagint, right, from
Yeah.
Septuagint. Now, folks, we're back in between the Older and Newer Testaments, right? Because we're at the end of the 1400 years of the Older Testament, and we're going to go to the New Testament. But what sits between them in the 400 years of silence is both the Septuagint and Hanukkah. So just want to say that, and then leave it to Seif. Go for it.
Let's kind of just make our way through history on the quick.
Yeah, please.
These disciples of Yeshua are writing, and in the wake of their passing, there's an interest in gathering the literature because it represents the authoritative voice that you want to get the story out. You got to get the story straight. We need to have some record of what Yeshua said and did, and then who's authorized to offer a telling of what does that mean for individuals and communities. This is where you have Paul in large measure, and you have the other literature in what we call the Newer Testament.
Right.
A few hundred years will pass, and Jerome.
Did you tell me about Yochanan ben Zakkai? We got through that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Keep going.
I'm done with that with the Older Testament.
Right, for now.
For now. I mean, there's much more to say, but kind of moving to the New to
Yeah.
get to the Greek. Jerome will pen the Latin Vulgate because now increasingly individuals are working with the Latin. What's going to happen in time, just to push it forward, once the printing press develops,
Right.
and we want to have an English version, okay, Wycliffe pens a translation of the Bible from the Latin text.
Okay, so let me ask a question. When we hear the word Wycliffe, and we know about Wycliffe Bible translators, they've been around a very, very long time, and they're a wonderful organization. Is Wycliffe a person, a place, or a thing? Tell me. Clear it up for me.
Wycliffe was someone, he was a revolutionary. He got killed. He wanted a translation in the lingua franca, in the language of the day, which was English. Now, what he does as a scholar, he translates it from the Latin.
Right, he's
Jerome.
translating from Jerome, who did the Vulgate?
Right.
Okay.
That's adjudged to be problematic, however. Tyndale's going to come along, and I'm kind of going to the point that you made where I'm pivoting from. Tyndale says that's nice, but what we actually need is a translation from the Hebrew and the Greek.
Right.
So we don't want a translation from a translation. We want a translation from the original text.
So you're saying that the Vulgate is a Latin translation of the Septuagint?
The Septuagint, and Jerome's genius, by the way, he was a philologist.
What's a philologist?
Language.
Oh,
He's like,
okay.
Dr. Brown, Michael Brown, one of our own. He speaks 11 dead languages. Jerome was a philologist, interested philologo, the love of word. So what he penned in a few languages, but it's his Latin that commended itself to the future. As the empire expands, and Latin the more so is spoken, Latin holds the day. Wycliffe is going to want to translate from the Latin because people didn't understand it. You're in medieval Europe, and the priest is reading from the Latin and reciting Latin, but no one understands
Nobody
it.
understands it. Yeah, it's a lot like people who like to hear the liturgies in Jewish services and they don't read Hebrew, but they just like the sound of it.
Yeah,
It's a real thing.
I'll speak as an academic. People say that's nice, it's profound. I don't know what the heck he's talking about.
It sounds so good. It
He's got
sounds so
right,
good,
by
though.
golly. Yeah. So what happens is that Tyndale wants a translation from the Hebrew and the Greek, and he does. But here's the problem. By the time you get to the King James Version, we're doing much the same. We're translating from the best Hebrew and Greek that's available. And it's a community endeavor of scholars.
Right.
But now, the original King James Version was translated into English. People today say, no, forget that TLV, it's King James only. We got to go with the original King James. Well, the original King James was written in English, but English had changed over the years. So the King James Version was translated then into what was modern English, let's say 100 years later, and the books are indistinguishable.
You can't tell
So what
I
happens
hear what you're
is
saying.
what we call now that we need the original 1611 King James Version, it's not even the original King James Version. It's the Shakespearean English of the day.
It's the. Did you say Shakespearean?
Shakespearean.
Okay.
It's beautiful. It's eloquent. And it breathed the idiom of the day.
The first one
idiom.
or the 100 years?
One,
the second one.
The one that we have.
The one that we have.
The one that we have, the classic traditional King James Version, wasn't that we have today that we revere as the only Bible, wasn't even the original King James Version, number one. Number two, even the King James Version that was originally produced was produced with the Apocrypha. We've thrown out over a dozen books.
Okay, the Apocrypha is the literature that you find in Catholic Bibles, right?
Yes.
They're in Catholic Bibles.
You find it now that the original Catholic Bible, St. Jerome, did not include the Apocrypha.
Okay.
The Apocrypha is...
The original. Okay, you're saying Jerome. Is that the guy with the okay.
The Vulgate.
The Vulgate.
Yeah.
Okay, can I ask a question? I get asked this a lot.
Yeah, you pay my salary, do whatever you
You're
want,
so
lady.
full of it. He works for almost nothing. He's very kind to me. I can't get over what a blessing you are and how much fun you are to hang out with, because he throws out this stuff while you're talking to him every day, and he just blows my mind.
See, I create the illusion I know what I'm talking about. So she thinks she needs me.
You're so funny. He makes
Job security.
Well, I really love learning about this stuff, because I'm going to tell you the things. There are certain things that people will say that are like a firebrand. It like tattoos your brain. It goes zzz, and you cannot forget it. And this is one of those things. And I won't tell you who told me or when they told me or how it affected me. I'm just going to say it. What happened when Eve ate the apple, and where was it that it says with her was not included? Somebody told me, somebody impressive that I appreciate, told me that the phrase that says she ate it and then Adam was with her, that the words with her were eliminated at the translation level of the Vulgate. Is that true?
I don't know.
We got to find out.
Go ahead, Boo.
Because I'll tell you what verse it is. It says here, I'm going to point out the verse, and then we're going to look at it next time we chat. We'll talk about it. But this is something that I think was very, very helpful, is that when it talks about, go back, I'm going to find this verse, but go back and I'll find it another time. The point is this. When you translate the Bible, there are all these texts you can translate from. And the closer you get to the beginning, the more authentic people think that it is. But realize that there's stuff that they decide to put in and stuff they decide to take out. And because language changes and it's a communication process, you can lead people down a path that's not healthy for them. And I want to we'll deal with that, but please get back to what you were talking about.
I'll get back in a way that builds from that.
Yeah,
so
can you? Because
creates a bridge.
yeah.
Yes. So we're talking. I'm talking, and you're listening, and I'm glad you like it, because that means I'll get a check next week.
You're so funny.
But we're kind of looking at the King James Bible that's using Hebrew and Greek text.
Right.
back then. Now, what's happened since 1611,
Right.
biblical archaeology and discovery has blossomed. We have a lot more texts now
Right.
to look at.
Right.
And there's a better understanding of Hebrew and Greek because, knowledge continues to develop. Now, there is the Textus Receptus, the Greek text that they prudently employed to translate into the English. But there's other Greek manuscripts that have been found since then that we can compare. And some are argued to be a better read than others. In the Newer Testament, there's some 6,000 examples of texts that have come down from antiquity. Whole manuscripts, sometimes fragments.
Right.
And so you can look at that and you can see certain variants, some typographical errors and what have you. Now, what'll happen?
Wait a minute, there's a typo in ancient texts?
Yes.
Yes.
Part of it is because if you look at some of these monks that are doing a Greek translation, they don't even speak Greek, they speak Latin, but they're just kind of drawing the letters. And then if you look at
That's amazing.
some words, if you look at Hebrew, the difference between a yud, a vav, and a nun is a slight flick of the finger.
100%.
And so what happens is the doctrine of inerrancy isn't claimed for those that produce manuscripts. It's claimed for the original autograph, the original document itself. There's then the process.
Okay, you just blew my mind. So give me a
Yes.
second.
Well,
give me a second. So what Dr. Seif is saying here is really important to note because I do not read Hebrew.
As long as she thinks it's important, I get
Shut
paid.
up. He's so horrible to me sometimes. You just
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'm an
Call it.
I'm an artist. I draw stuff. So I sing in Hebrew and I draw in Hebrew and I can speak some Hebrew, but the Hebrew of today that they speak in Israel isn't even the Hebrew that they write in the biblical text. But when Dr. Seif's talking, when you're talking about just a flick of the wrist changes the letter. If you're talking we're talking in English to English speakers. So I want you to think about the difference between a lowercase t and an uppercase t. Think about the difference that if your hand slips, your elbow moves, and it looks like a small t as opposed to a big T, if someone's looking at that and they're reviewing your manuscript, they're like, oh yeah, that's supposed to be a T. We'll get it next round, keep moving, right? Realize that Hebrew letters are art. They're an art form. And when you make those pictures, your brain thinks what that picture, the value of that picture. And so the way that Hebrew is so, we're counting on it to be accurate today when you're talking about things that have been written thousands of years ago, then they're checked against like when I look at a Torah scroll, I have come to understand what the letters are and what they mean, but I'm not a Hebrew scholar. But I am an artist. So when I want to share something in Hebrew to evoke an emotion, like the name of God, if I don't draw it exactly accurately so that people recognize the letters, so if the letters warp or there's a stain or a blemish in the skin of the lamb it's written on, you can change what it says. And so I think that what you're talking about is really important and people don't give that enough thought.
Yes, and then if you make the typo.
Right.
And by the way, I did my devotions. Barry and I read the Bible. This is my Tree of Life version, big print, because I'm an old guy. There was a typo this morning we saw where it just doesn't not happen.
Exactly.
Best attempts notwithstanding. The problem is in antiquity, you have a text and there's a typo. Whoever makes a copy of that text is moving the typo forward and then creating their own.
Ding, 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 ding,
now,
get it.
Now, what you'll find in this Bible and study Bibles, though this is less a study Bible, the TLV, though it's a Bible to be studied.
Right.
What you'll find is you'll look at a text and there'll be an italicized letter and it'll say some manuscripts include this, some exclude this. You let your reader know where it is.
Right.
And
for example, the best example of that, by the way, if you want to check it out sometime, is the Lord's Prayer. That's the simplest one of all the times people ask me about that. That's the example that I use. That if you read, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And at the end of it, you say, for yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, right? That that phrase is not in all manuscripts. So in the Tree of Life version, we chose not to put in things that weren't in by a certain date. So a biblical text has a date timestamp. I don't think people realize that.
Yeah.
That manuscripts, so the Tree of Life version of the Bible is going to stay, and we're fixing the typos as we go. How many typos were in the recent King James? Somebody told me there was 400 in there at one point. That it's you can't. There is no perfect text.
Yeah, and that's the traditional King James
Yeah,
version.
the traditional King James version that everybody says is perfect and the only one you should read. I agree that if you've found a comfort level with your Bible, just read it. God will speak to you. I'm not here to argue which translation is better. I'm simply here to say that every translation of the Bible from the oldest texts, like the Tree of Life, the reason that it is so important to date, timestamp that text is because you can fix a typo, but you can't keep messing with the language because language changes over time.
Right.
And so we have a time date stamp on our text. And as, 500 years from now, there's going to, because, I realize Messiah can come back before that and I would be thrilled. But in case he doesn't, there is the birth of a translation, then there is the growth of a translation till it's accepted. The TLV is accepted. It's been 10 years in print now. And then, but 100 years from now, the words may not mean the same things. And we're going to have to go back to the original languages, look at the recently discovered texts and archaeological digs, and redress the issue. But that's what I think makes this so interesting, is that 400 years after the King James is already, and that's the one that made it to presses, so it went much further, and we can talk about that sometime because that's fascinating to me. Talk about how English translations in America have grown, because that's stuff that I know about. But let's get back to the history of how we got there, just recognizing that every translation has a date timestamp. And if you don't treat the Bible like that, if you just keep retranslating and retranslating and re-updating, then what you end up doing is you're controlling the narrative of the text instead of letting God autocorrect you with the text, because there isn't a perfect text. So continue on with what you were talking about, because we were in a wonderful place right after we were from Septuagint to the Vulgate, Septuagint in Greek of the day, Vulgate, Latin of the day, Wycliffe, English, but of the day, but from the older stuff.
Right. From the Latin. Tyndale, the English of the day, from the Hebrew and the Greek. The King James Version, the English of the day, from available Hebrew and Greek texts. Today, 2024, and proximate time to this, we found all sorts of new texts. There's the Nag Hammadi codices, you have texts, you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have a variety of other texts as well that we can compare. And when you look at committees that do translations, and that's partly the genius of the TLV, as opposed to the work of my good friend, the late Dr. David Stern, who tendered the complete Jewish Bible. That was an individual, and his wife helped. And I was just with Martha a few weeks ago in Israel. Lovely people. But the TLV...
Groundbreaking work, the complete Jewish Bible. We would not have the Tree of Life without the complete Jewish Bible. The
genius of the TLV, it's a community endeavor.
Right.
And the people that are working on it are going back to Hebrew and Greek and translating it into the modern vernacular. But we're adding something to it that kind of goes against the grain of what we're talking about. We're talking about the need to put a translation into a language that people can understand, the importance of that. As we bring this to a close, partly what we're doing it is we're putting it in a language they don't understand, but they want to, because we're salting it with Hebraisms, that individuals will read our version of the text, and they're running into Hebrew words, and we have glossaries to explain. It's deliberate. We're consciously wanting the reader to bump into the reality, whether it's the old or the new. It's a Jewish story at the end of the day.
Oh my gosh, that's so well said. We're going to put that on a postcard and send it to people. That's the most amazing thing. That's exactly what we're doing. we're trying to reverse engineer the translation process. And I just want you to know, if you need to study the Bible and want to learn the ancient Hebrew and want to learn modern Hebrew, they're not the same thing, folks. Language changes over time. But the intent of God to talk to his people through the scriptures is real and true and available to us today. And with the Tree of Life version, our goal was to cause you to stop, like using the word, like we could get into that another time. I'm really genuinely not here to make you buy a TLV. I just genuinely want you to know that I want to know the Bible. I want to know where it comes from. I want to give an appropriate answer. But more than anything else, I love God more than anything. And I love Yeshua and that he saved me and forgave me. But that salvation process starts you on a road to sanctification, to being set apart by God. And part of being set apart is understanding what he's trying to say to us. And there are concepts in the growth of your relationship with God that are sparked like a match. It'll spark you to think a different way. And sometimes just knowing that his name is Yeshua and recognizing that Jesus is Jewish is enough to cause people to want to get saved. But the bigger question is, do you know the God that met Moses in the bush? Because that God is the one who sent Yeshua. And reading it all as one story that's been a journey of discovery for all of us is what we're trying to preserve for future generations. And yeah, causing people to stop at a Hebrew word is because I learned the value of that word. And when I had to teach it to my children, they learned the Hebrew word instead of the English. Like my kids, the word shalom feels different to me than peace. Peace I can have with anybody. Shalom is when God's in the mix. When God's in the mix with me, when the peace that I have with the other person is based on my peace with God. So there's a value to those Hebrew words that are, because they evoke a deeper relationship with God for me, and I wanted to share those with the world. So thanks for hopping on board the train. We're on the first stop, folks. We have figured out how we got to we found out how we got to Wycliffe. Next time we hang out, we're going to go from Wycliffe forward, and maybe we'll just let God guide us. But I cannot thank you enough. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for our time together. We're so grateful, Lord, that your word is true. And I pray, Father God, that as you move us forward, that we will continue to give you all the glory and praise. Thank you for the Bible, Lord God. Every single translation of it that has moved the needle forward so that we can find you. You're the one we're looking for, and the Bible is our compass. So thank you, Lord, for meeting us today in this space. And bless Dr. Seif's socks off. Just do something wonderful and awesome for him, Lord God, because he loves you, and we're nuts about him too. So from the whole Greenberg family, love and blessings to you, God. Bless your son, Dr. Seif, and his beautiful wife, Miss Berry. God bless you and keep you. Shalom. We'll see you soon.